Hello, my name is Erica Miller, and I decided to look at the NHL API for this, and I quickly discovered that there's a completely new NHL API for this hockey season, so there isn't quite much documentation on it yet, because all of the documentation is by fellow fans and data science nerds, so there's no actual documentation released by the NHL, so it's slowly coming along as more fans and database nerds look into this. Um, so I list my sources up here, which, like I said, there's not much documentation, so a lot of it is now not as useful as before, but it was useful to some extent. Um, so I'll go quickly through, just imports and some constants to make later work easier. So this has all the abbreviations for team names, and then their different divisions and conferences, and then info about the teams, so their full names and team colors. And here, I'm not going to go through everything. This is just me trying to figure out how the API works with all of the different endpoints and actually discovering what they are. So, this was my first thing I did, was just look at the current schedule for when I was originally doing it. And then there's a bunch of other ones which feel free to look at yourself to see my thought process going through. And some of it follows this second link here, just with the new endpoints rather than the old one. And to show you what I had to do to figure out the API, so this is on Chrome developer tools. I brought up Mitch Marner just as an example. I'm a Toronto fan, so that's why I picked him. Go into developer tools, network, and then here you can see landing, and then this is the URL for the endpoint to actually find all of the JSON that has all of the data in it that shows up on this page, which is ultimately useful to me when I'm trying to use that myself. So to start, I wanted to get all of the game IDs and player IDs, because every game has a unique ID and every player has a unique ID. I wanted to get those all into a list so that I can use them later on, because it's a lot easier if you have them in a list now rather than having to get the list every single time. So here I looked at the current season for the Maple Leafs, and I looked at the game outcomes. So reg stands for regulation, which is the standard 3 periods of play. If at the end of that the game is still tied, they go into overtime, which is a 5-minute period with less players on the ice, to hopefully get them to score a point. If at the end of that there is still a tie, then they go to a shootout, which is just one player versus one goalie. It's a little more complicated than that, but until someone shoots a goal. But so you can see that the Maple Leafs, usually it ends in regulation, but there has been some overtime and shootouts this season. In here, I look at the ratio of goals to games played of forwards and defense. So obviously the forwards are probably going to be scoring more goals per game than a defensive player. So you can see that trend here. You can see the highest defenseman is lower than the highest forward, and also you can see just how skewed these are in this way, in that there aren't that many star players, as I'm sure you're not surprised. Not everyone can have amazing stats. So you can see that there. And here I decided to look at all of the different penalties that happen in the league. So you can see that tripping is the most common penalty, with 17% being tripping, versus there's quite a few where only one has happened this season so far, which is like playing without a helmet, goalie leaving the crease, which is the area around the goal, and like unsportsmanlike conduct from the bench. It's there's a lot of different penalties. Yeah. And here I look at the stats of some veteran players that are still active. So first I decided to look at Ovechkin, and you can see these average goals per game, average assists per game, and average points per game. So you can see where he, hit his peak. But overall, he's never been, like, a bad player. It's important to note that this doesn't go to 0 on this plot, so... And there's no year where he scored no points, or no assists, or no goals. I would get him on the team at that point. But you get what I'm saying. He is still a good player throughout all of these years. Similarly, I did the same thing for Sidney Crosby. And you can see he has even more of a dramatic spike in the years between 09 and 12 here, but it's a similar stats for him. And then lastly, I decided to look at a goalie instead. So I looked at Marc-Andre Fleury over the years. So this instead is average save percentage. So his average goal or shots saved per shots coming at him. So you can see he's always had, a high save percentage. It's always been, other than his very first couple seasons, it's always been above 0.9. And of course this last season it's just dropped down to 0.88, but it's important to note we're pretty early into the season, so you can't always look at stats of a not completed season versus ones that are in the past. Then next I looked at the birthplace of active NHL players. So I don't think it's that surprising that most NHL players are from the North America, because obviously the entire league is here in North America between the US and Canada. So 41% are Canadian, about 30% are from the US, and then the closest next team is Sweden with just under 10%, and then Russia with 6%, and then as it goes on. And after Canada and the US, there are only European players other than one Australian player. So it's very much just the North America and Europe here. So here I looked at the types of shots for the goals that are scored in this season. And this is a very good showcase of when not to use a pie chart. Throughout looking at all this data, I kept trying to put it in a pie chart, and it just never looked good in any of this data. So, it's very hard to interpret, these tiny little slices versus these big ones. It's hard to actually figure out, especially some of these rarely happen, so you can barely even see their little slivers. So here I went back to doing, a table instead. It's a lot easier to interpret. And you can see 50% of goals are wrist shots, versus, it's not that common to get an own goal. There only 2 happen this season so far. Makes up less than 0.2% of all goals. So, alright, and here is where I actually get to the meat of why I wanted to look into the NHL API. And it's going to require a lot of explanation up front about how hockey works in its scoring in terms of the standing of teams. So, be prepared. So, the current system, you get 2 points for a win, whether it's in regulation, overtime, or a shootout. You get 1 point for an overtime loss or a shootout loss, and you get no points for a regulation loss. So what's good about this is that it does not allow for any ties. Previously, in a tie, both teams would get 1 of the 2 points, and a lot of people don't like this system because overtime and shootout games have more total points given. They have a total of 3 points given, versus a regulation game only has 2 points given. A lot of people don't like how this can encourage teams to stall into overtime to lock in a point, and how 1 point, which is half a win essentially, can hinge on a shootout. So some have proposed a 5-point system instead, And in this system, a regulation win would be 5 points, an overtime win would be 4 points, a shootout win would be 3 points, a shootout loss would be 2 points, an overtime loss would be 1 point, and a regulation loss would be 0 points. So you can see how as you win earlier in the game, the more points you get. As you lose later in the game, the more points you get. So it really encourages winning as soon as possible. So, yeah, and it's important to note in what I'm going to say following is that I'm looking at previous seasons' statistics and then looking at those and then putting the 5-point system onto them. So obviously the players have not gotten the chance to strategize differently if they were actually in a 5-point system. So obviously it's not definitive proof to say, oh, this team would have had this many points and been this spot in the standings if 5-point system instead, because they probably would have strategized differently if it was a different system. So here, I'm not going to go too far into the actual code of it, but I looked at last season, because obviously it doesn't really make sense to look at a current season for this if I want to look at how the standings would have possibly changed. So I looked at the 2022-2023 season. I'll scroll down. You can see split by the divisions. You can see that it didn't really actually change that much in terms of how everyone ended up. Like at most, like a couple people or a couple teams swapped, but the top 3, which are the most important to look at because the top 3 of each division go into the playoffs, they didn't change at all. At most in the Metropolitan, the leader changed, but the overall makeup didn't change. So that's the same. And then on top of that, we have the wild cards, which are the next 2 teams in each conference. Those also didn't change. So this would have been, or a 5-point system would have just caused the same playoffs to happen. It wouldn't have changed the overall makeup of the teams in the playoffs. So with that, I went on to do the same thing for the 2021-2022 season. So again, I'm going to scroll past all of the actual code of it. And the same thing. There was a little bit of shake-ups with the ordering, but the top 3 didn't change at all. So that was the same. And for the wild cards, it was the same thing. There was a bit of shake-ups with exactly how the overall league was ordered, but there wasn't any changes to who would have made the playoffs. So a 5-point system wouldn't have changed the playoffs in this theoretical world. But yeah, I hope to be able to look into even more previous seasons and just keep going back and back and back and see what that would have looked like, and maybe a possible way, because another reason that a system like this would probably be really tough to implement is you can look just at this, how hard it is to interpret the old system versus a possible new system like this, because you would think 119 is horrible looking in comparison to 275, but it's just a different system. So you would have to do some sort of conversion from one to the other to make it make sense in looking at historical hockey data. But yeah, that is my work. I hope to continue digging into the NHL API. It's been a lot of fun doing it, so I'd love to keep looking into it. Thank you.